My name is Dr. Ron Goodwin, and this lecture is about Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. And it's going to ask the question whether or not this monumental achievement really introduced new freedoms along with a new republic, or did it just simply maintain the status quo for a new generation of aristocracy? For the most part, we're very comfortable with the Declaration of Independence. We understand the concept of all men are created equal. They're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. But we also have to deal with what was going on at the time that the Founding Fathers agreed to those immortal words. We understand that there was slavery. We understand that women did not have the same rights. We understand that the indigenous peoples of this land were routinely slaughtered indiscriminately. But we need to get an idea of the events that happened before 1775 and 1776 to fully understand the context in which the Founding Fathers lived, the context in which this document was created and evolved, and try to somehow determine if those words really have meaning for us in a 21st century context. So this lecture will begin with the discussion of those events, whether it's the Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party, that led up to the American Revolution and ultimately the Declaration of Independence. We need to determine and try to ascertain what was the intent of the Declaration of Independence. Were those words specifically written for that generation? Or did the Founding Fathers have this idea that one day this new republic will live up to these words? And we need to see exactly what the impact of these words are today. Are there impacts today? Is it applicable? Is it still applicable to us in a 21st century context? When we deal with the European invasion of the New World, we begin, of course, with Christopher Columbus, who made his way into the West Indies, and ultimately the Spanish would follow, and they would explore South America, Central America, and to the southern parts of the United States. Ultimately, the British would get involved, also in an attempt to take advantage of the natural resources in this new world in their competition against France and Spain because of the events surrounding the Glorious Revolution, surrounding the Reformation. And one thing that I already mentioned that we cannot ignore when we talk about this invasion of the New World is the impact of African slavery. So beginning with Jamestown, which will become known as Virginia, England transported its citizens across the Atlantic into the New World, and they ultimately developed what became known as the 13 colonies at the time of the Revolution. So this idea of colonization needs to be discussed. England became what is typically considered the mother country. So the mother country will develop colonies for the purpose of acquiring resources that were not available within that mother country. So once those citizens, because those individuals who were in the New World, in the British colonies, were still considered citizens of Great Britain, still considered under the authority of the king and parliament. So just because they were not within the mother country did not mean that they were any less British citizens. It didn't mean that they had any less responsibility to the crown. And the crown did not have any less responsibilities to them. And that becomes important as these colonies begin to develop and they begin to develop agriculture, starting from tobacco, then moving into cotton, because those products were controlled by England and had to come through England before they were sold outside of the kingdom. They were profiting England. But as we saw, and there's several examples where those folks within the colonies decided that they wanted to, for lack of a better phrase, cut out the middleman and trade directly with France or trade directly with Spain. And that would increase their profits. But that was illegal. And England established several navigation acts, those laws that directly prohibited direct sales of these products to other countries. Everything produced in the colonies must come through England first. During the time of the Great Revolution, we see call it the introduction of John Locke. He was a philosopher in Europe, and he wrote the two treatises of government. And what he argued is that monarchs do not have absolute power over their subjects. And he emphasized the concept of natural rights and the social contract theory. So John Locke is important to us because many of the principles that Thomas Jefferson used in the Declaration of Independence were Lockean theories, Lockean philosophies. So it's important at this point to really sort of understand, ask the question, what is the function of a civil government? Locke believed the function of a legitimate government is to protect the natural rights of those who are being governed. And he defined that as the rights to life, liberty, health, and property. Second, a government has a responsibility to punish those individuals who violate the natural rights of others. And lastly, the government is to pursue that course of action, those policies, that decision that is in the best interest of the majority, even when this may conflict with the natural rights of all individuals. From a timeline, it is after the French and Indian War in 1763 that we see England now saddled with this massive war era debt. And they're also trying to regain control of the colonies. England established new taxes, the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act, and these taxes to raise revenues out of the colonies. But those revenues, those actions were also an attempt to punish the American colonies for their behavior during the French and Indian War. The colonies continued to trade illegally with the French. There was some question from the English perspective, can we catch them? Do we know? But it was sort of understood what the colonies were doing, because the colonies at this point were basically saying that they didn't have a problem with the French. This is where we begin to see the development of a separate identity from Great Britain, from the king and the crown. They began to see themselves, yes, as English citizens still, but they began to also see themselves as citizens of the American colonies. Now, lastly, as a result of the French and Indian War, France is going to give up that territory, which will eventually become the Louisiana Purchase during Jefferson's presidency. We know about the Boston Tea Party. In an effort to resist the new taxes, in an effort to resist the policies of the British Parliament and the Crown, the tea was destroyed in Boston's harbor. But it is the aftermath of that is going to take us into ultimately Lexington and Concord in 1775, before the meeting of the Second Continental Congress, which will ultimately lead to George Washington being selected to lead an army that did not yet exist. So coming into that summer of 1775, the Founding Fathers made their decision. There was no going back. The decision to separate from England was made. Now, since we're going to have to fight for this freedom, fight for this new republic, this new government that does not yet exist, we need to state the reasons why. We've got to be very clear, because we are going to need allies. We are going to need to do all those things which countries, which they will say, must have rights to do within the international community. So we need to consider the Declaration in basically 4 distinct parts. First part is the preamble, and this is where it begins to state the argument that every now and then one people must separate from another and assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station. But within that separation, they also declared that they should tell the world why this is happening. The second part established the Founding Fathers' assertion that all people in a civil society are equal and have certain inalienable rights. Legitimate governments are created by a majority of the people that they govern. This is where they get their authority from. Their power to govern comes from the people that they govern. And if a legitimate government fails to protect the rights of the people then have an obligation to change that government into a form that will protect their rights. Now, let me stop for a second. One of the issues that we have in history is dealing with the American Civil War and whether or not the South, the Confederate States of America, had a legal right to exist. Abraham Lincoln said that they did not. But when you look at the rebel leadership, they took their cue from the Founding Fathers. Their argument was that the government that would exist under Abraham Lincoln would not protect their rights. So therefore, according to the Declaration of Independence, they had the right to change that government. So they were following the exact playbook from the Founding Fathers, that they were going to change the existing government because they felt, a majority of their citizens felt, that that government was no longer protecting their rights. Part 3 details the list of grievances against King George. And the last part of the Declaration of Independence is where there's this formal statement, this formal declaration that we are independent from the King of Great Britain, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. All political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. That Declaration of Independence gave birth to the United States of America. But keep in mind that just because you've now declared your independence, you still have to fight for it. And we're going to see years of intense struggle. The most recognizable phrase, aspect of the Declaration of Independence is the idea that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The aristocracy, not a British aristocracy, but a new American aristocracy that excluded poor whites. It excluded the indigenous population, those folks that we call the Native American. It excluded blacks, not just black slaves, but blacks in general. And it also excluded women. At what point do we see the Declaration of Independence as being inclusive of all of the individuals in the United States, or the individuals who would be part of the United States? So, 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, Martin Luther King referred to the Declaration of Independence as a promissory note during the March on Washington. He said it was a promissory note that had come due. In those words, Jefferson's words of all men are created equal, was really the basis of the greatness of this republic. Now, keep in mind, this is 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, where African Americans are still grappling with segregation, unequal living in a society that they were contributing to. What about poor whites? We know that Andrew Jackson worked hard for the rights of the common man, And by the time of the Civil War in 1860, there were very few barriers to poor whites being able to vote. We know that women received their right to vote with the 19th Amendment in 1920. And we know that black males were given the right to vote with the 15th Amendment during Reconstruction. So I'm using the idea of voting to correlate to citizenship, to correlate to equal access, to all of the benefits found within the Republic and within the country. Lest we forget the indigenous population of Native Americans. It wasn't until 1924 that they were officially recognized as citizens of the United States. But even then, we know the history of how the Native Americans have been treated going back into the late 19th century and coming forward. It is still one of the saddest chapters of American history. So where are we today? When we deal with citizenship, where are we? Where does the Declaration of Independence fit today? So if we say that all men are created equal and they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights to access within the society, if we define that access as citizenship, we know that there have always been efforts to limit the ability to vote. And what does that look like? Poll taxes, property tests, direct violence. We know the history of lynching in this country. Literacy tests, the grandfather clause that was used after the Civil War, after emancipation, and then the all-white primaries in the early 20th century. To summarize this lecture, yes, the Declaration of Independence did provide the ideological foundation for the new republic, but at the same time, it did maintain a status quo of rule, political rule, by a privileged few, by excluding a majority of the electorate within the 18th, 17th century society. Coming forward into today, there are those individuals, Martin Luther King, who believed that the Declaration of Independence did not just refer to that particular moment in time, that the founding fathers were looking forward into generations that had not yet come on the scene and saying, this is what we hope this republic becomes. That this republic will become this shining city on a hill that will be inclusive of everyone. That is what King believed in 1963 and going into his civil rights activities, that this country could be better than what it was. In the 21st century, we see an effort to sort of retard that growth, if you will. We see strategies throughout the South now to limit the electorate and to limit the citizenship and political impacts of certain minority groups. Those are the facts, and it is left up to us to decide how we're going to live with that or not live with it. How do we continue to make this society one that is inclusive of everyone and will give everyone the same opportunity for success and to live the life that God intended them to live? Thank you very much. And I do hope that you gained something from this. Till next time.